The Airline Business Podcast is sponsored by Panasonic Avionics. Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, 2023 is almost over, but was it a good year for the airlines? My name's Graham Dunn, Executive Editor at Flight Global, and joining me as ever is Airline Business Editor Lewis Harper. Hi Lewis.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Yeah, good. We're just sort of winding down from the year 2023, and I mean, as ever, you get to this time of year and everything becomes reflective, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. You're sort of looking back and equally, wanting to look forward and trying to guess what next year will bring. And it's quite instructive sometimes, I think, to look back at what we thought 2023 was going to bring. And in many ways, I think, while I think in the second half we're going to focus a bit more on some of the challenges, but I think 2023 did bring some pretty positive developments for the industry. And some were surprises, some were expected. Clearly, as I say, there have been new challenges emerge as well. But I think going into 2023, there was obviously an expectation that the industry was powering out of COVID more, but also going into this year, we knew that China hadn't reopened yet, and that was going to always weigh on, certainly when you look at Asia Pacific's recovery and even the global recovery, given what a huge market is. Without that international traffic, it was always going to weigh on the recovery. And also in 2022, obviously a big theme was some of the operational challenges that happened at airports. And, I remember going into this year thinking, have we overcome them? And I think to an extent maybe we did, but obviously new things emerged. So, but you were at the IATA Global Media Day, weren't you, recently? And that was quite a good opportunity to hear what they were thinking on sort of how things had gone, wasn't it?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the outtake or the outcome, or I'm sure there's a proper word for that. But certainly the view ultimately is it was probably a better year than expected, actually. When IATA had increased their industry profit forecasts for 2023 about halfway through the year, as some of those factors kicked in. And in fact, in their latest forecast, they doubled it again. And, the industry was seen making a profit of making a profit of, a little bit over 20 billion US dollars. I always get those two confused, billion, which is, actually, a very creditable performance. I mean, IATA, as they regularly do, point out that, in terms of per passenger margin, airlines are still making essentially the price of a cup of coffee on that. I mean, fortunately, the price of a cup of coffee has increased exponentially due to inflation.
It doesn't sound too bad, does it?
Yeah. But a profit in excess of 20 billion is pretty respectable. And certainly from I think what people were thinking at the start of the year, much more optimistic around that. You're absolutely right. It is intriguing going back to where we were a year or so ago. I think when you spoke to airline executives, they would mention revenge travel. Everyone talked about revenge travel. And I think there's very much a question of whether that demand was going to be sustainable or whether it would fall off. And overall, demand has remained strong, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. And, it's questionable the value in looking at, the period in isolation. But certainly when you do, without thinking about whether, it will turn out to be that sort of revenge travel or pent up demand is waning. Certainly in isolation, the year looks very strong. And I think, in revenue terms, we all know that it was a year of high yields on the passenger side, if not on the cargo side, as we talked about in the previous pod, although they were still, above pre-COVID levels, but there are other challenges there. But certainly on the passenger side, it really did turn out to be a year where, while margins are still clearly a challenge, as IATA will regularly talk about, it being one to remember from that point of view. And as we talked about several times over the year, plenty of airlines have seen revenue power way above 2019 levels this year on traffic that, while it's nearly there in most cases, nearly back, and obviously in some cases beyond 2019 levels, overall it's still lagging by a few percentage points 2019 levels. And I think next year we'll clearly, as IATA have said, we'll see the 2019 benchmark passed fairly quickly, I think. But yeah, it's been a strong year from that point of view, and yeah, lots to think about. As our airline business columnist Chris Tarry is fond of pointing out, looking at the industry level, even looking at the regional level, does tend to mask stories within that which aren't quite as strong, and also stories where the market normalization maybe is starting to play through. But yeah, in isolation, a really strong year.
As you mentioned, there were other concerns going into the year, which, sort of didn't really materialize. So you mentioned the operational challenges that we saw last year. And, I think we'd probably say that it was business as usual year, which, it isn't great. We obviously had air traffic control issues, you have congestion issues, all the issues that were there before the crisis, but those additional scenes at airports being unable to cope. That at least was one headache that kind of mitigated a bit. And as you say, another factor, which is, is probably one of the factors that was behind the increase in profitability forecast from IATA, was China coming back and how sudden that was. Again, it's difficult to remember as sort of a period, around a year ago, people were still questioning when China's zero tolerance approach to COVID would begin to end, because, it was only around this period last year where you started to see the signs of a change in thinking. And actually when it came immediately.
It did, yes. And as I said, has had a huge impact. I think, talked to a lot of CEOs, particularly in that region, and the recovery in China, while it's hugely welcomed, and it took a few months really into the year before the kind of restrictions were fully released, I think. So it has been a slightly tentative return. So that, but even so, it's clearly better, much better than anyone expected going into the year. And as you say, generally that kind of view going into this year. I remember obviously Tim Clark talking about ranking the headwinds the industry was facing sort of in 2022, looking into this year, sort of 9 out of 10. There were where it's geopolitical challenges, whether it was some of the operational challenges. No one was 100% comfortable, and a lot of people probably still aren't, about COVID and what impact that might have. And I remember Willie Walsh pushing back against that a bit, the IATA Director General, suggesting the industry's used to dealing with these sorts of challenges, and generally it's sort of proven that. And I think the other and really interesting trend has been on corporate travel, for example, that, when you look at all the predictions of some of the structural changes people perhaps thought might happen as a result of the COVID pandemic, I think one that is actually playing out, and it depends on the market, but certainly in some it's quite significant, is corporate travel is 60-70% of what it was pre-COVID. But what I think 2023 has shown is that what has sustained is that that has been replaced by premium leisure travel, and so far so good on that, really, in most markets. That airlines are learning to live maybe with a structurally lower level of corporate travel in some cases, and they've been able to do that. So that I guess is another positive coming out of this year.
Yeah, and the sort of the fundamentals are pretty strong, and we'll talk about probably the negative side of the capacity challenges that this industry has faced, which shifted less from whether planes could actually leave and arrive at airports because of the staff shortages to more a question of whether airlines get hold of aircraft. But, one of the flip sides of that, of course, is that that's also the constraints on capacity have also led to, strong load factors and supported strong yields as well. So I think to some extent there remains a question about demand in terms of if you had unfettered capacity, would they chuck the capacity out there, and would that have a negative impact on some of the profitability elements in this industry, and what kind of lessons it's learned from the past? But certainly demand is really encouraging.
Yeah, the capacity thing is a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it? As you say, it's a cap on ambition, but equally coming out of a huge crisis, certainly for the established players, it hasn't been an outright negative, I think it's fair to say. And in some cases it has, certainly for incumbents anyway, it's really supported a strong recovery. You look at load factors, they sort of ending the year around 2019 levels. So, given capacity is globally anyway, still slightly off 2019 levels, it's reasonable to say that it will be interesting what happens when capacity does significantly rise above where we were. But having said that, we have missed 3 years of almost certainly would have been growth in airline capacity because of the pandemic. So, even getting back to where we were in 2019 means that we're still behind, a long way behind where we would have been otherwise. So yeah, clearly also we're heading into 2024 with, as you hinted at there, we know that capacity is going to be restricted next year as well, not least because of the continued supply chain challenges, MRO challenges, and the specific challenges around, some Pratt & Whitney engines that are grounding, a significant number of aircraft, often at carriers where, a significant number were already grounded. So you're talking aircraft for a reasonably large carrier like Indigo, for example, hearing them talk about, already having, 30 aircraft on the ground because of supply chain challenges. You add in probably the same again through, quite a lot of next year. But equally, that might just cap growth rather than reduce capacity. So, airlines that are continuing to take new aircraft, can do something about that. It's not necessarily going to lead to reduced capacity. And, there are plenty of things airlines are doing in terms of, wet leasing, whatever, to counter it. But it does all contribute to an environment where when you've got that strong pent-up demand and you've got that capacity capped, it's looking all right. And I think more widely looking at what really drives airline demand, you look at the global economy. And while, again, thinking about the headwinds we thought were ahead looking into this year, I think it's reasonable to say, again, talking very generally, that things haven't been quite as bad as some expectations were. Inflation, for example, we're ending the year with inflation in a lot of key markets way down on where it was at the start of the year. Oil prices, while there have been some challenges along the way, they're not looking quite as scary as perhaps they were at some point. So, in terms of the wider indicators as well, it's certainly not as bad as it could have been. Again, it's not great in many cases, and I think the growth in certainly some of the more mature economies globally isn't probably quite as exciting as people would want. But yeah, it's certainly not as bad as it could have been. And so all underpinning this kind of the sense that, it's certainly been a year, certainly if you view it in isolation, that has been better than expected and pretty, some pretty impressive figures. And I think that, again, been reflected, hasn't it, in sort of the return of a lot of airlines talking about growth plans. I think that's been something we've noticed over the past few months.
Yeah, I think maybe we saw earlier in the year, maybe even a bit last year, airlines and airline CEOs would maybe say, "Oh, the pandemic's behind us now," but you didn't really get the sense they necessarily believed it. I think there's a sort of a fear of, they're almost trying to bring in some positive thinking around that. And at this stage, as you say, markets like China, international capacity, China is still well down. The pandemic in parts of the market, the impact of it is still being felt. But I think what was clear is this year there's a really clear, obvious shift in the mentality of boardrooms and of shareholders that it is time to get on with it. It is time to start thinking positively again. As I think I mentioned on the podcast last time, you barely meet or talk to an airline CEO where there isn't either a plan, to double the size of the fleet or to increase operating margins. And we've seen both IAG and and Air France very recently, Air France KLM very recently, setting out their kind of long-term investment plans. And of course, it's been, this is stuff that it's all been on hold for 2-3 years whilst they're in sort of crisis management. And so you can see now that the airlines are looking ahead. And that's why, and it's no coincidence that we're seeing this glut of aircraft orders coming through. Now, on the one hand, that is a bit self-perpetuating. You do have airlines are having now to, as delivery slots get eaten up, airlines start to think, well, maybe we better order some aircraft as well. But it's very much of that mindset of people are thinking, what are we going to do? Where are we going to be in the next 10 years? And airlines have finally got the bandwidth to think about that again. And I think that's probably the biggest success story of this year. Yes, it's been a profitable year. Nothing compared to the losses that have been made during the course of the pandemic. But I think it's one of mindset, and I think you are seeing airlines thinking forward again, both in terms of their own fleet plans and also a bit more in terms of consolidation and partnership as well.
Exactly, yeah. That consolidation aspect of this year has been quite striking as well, I think, particularly as we come towards the end of the year. Again, as you say, I think it does reflect that sense that COVID is properly behind us and we're looking ahead. And, all of this is about suddenly, you do need to think about that long-term capacity. And certainly I think consolidation is a part of the thinking there as well in some cases. No one's firefighting anymore, essentially. So we're back thinking about scale and the long-term strategy there. So, as you say, the consolidation side of things is going to be a theme I think we're going to see in 2024. Clearly, while there are lots of moves ongoing, I think there's a lot of regulators to get past and a lot of decisions to be made there. And I think 2024 will be a year where a lot of that, I think, will play out, and will certainly be really interesting where we are in a year's time to see, how many of these deals that are being talked about at the moment or are in progress at the moment have actually come to pass. So
I think that part's really interesting, and I think I can't really tell who is going to blink first, whether it's regulator or an airline. But I think eventually an airline will decide if the price of the cost or the price of growing is worth the concession hit. I don't know which airline that will be, but I think eventually one of the big European network carriers will probably decide, let's go for it. And I think when that happens, they'll all go for it. But whether that happens next year or whether that's a little bit away, who knows? I think it's the really interesting, because I'm not sure there's any, for a lot of airlines, there's not really any alternative. I think you only have to look at the challenge that, Norwegian and Widerøe are having in getting that deal over the line. These carriers already have strong positions in their domestic home markets. They can't really strengthen that anymore, almost from a regulatory perspective. So where else are they going to grow? How are they going to get those synergies? And, the flip side of that consolidation, we talked about people thinking long-term ahead. I think you've also got people thinking long-term ahead who find themselves back running airlines that don't want to be. So you have governments. I mean, in Portugal, you have the Portuguese government, admittedly now probably a different Portuguese government, but you have a Portuguese government which has kind of sold TAP, that's not something we have to worry about. It's not our concern, and now finds itself as the owner again.
Precisely, yeah, and that is certainly a story to watch next year, how that one plays out. And of course, we know that what's interesting is that whatever regulators do, it doesn't necessarily stopping consolidation doesn't mean that everything's fine and rosy. With lots of competition from that moment on, as we've seen in Colombia, for example, this year, where distressed airlines, Avianca, for example, interested in Viva Air, or the interest there was in Ultra Air, two airlines collapsing, and the concessions weren't worth it for any interested party to actually take them on. But all that happens is those two airlines disappear anyway, and the market shifts towards the established players. Clearly it might open up opportunities for JetSmart, for example, moving in there. But whatever happens, it's not like the decision not to go ahead with the consolidation means that that the competitive environment is saved and consumers are going to be washed with options on those routes or at those airports, whatever it. So from that point of view, we're obviously the big decision on JetBlue and Spirit to come. I say that tentatively because there's one way we can guarantee there'll be a decision is to say that now, and it'll happen before we're able to put the podcast out. But yeah, that's a really interesting one. I think if that does get blocked, there's what's going to play out there, because we know that that some of the US carriers, for example, in the low cost sphere, haven't had the strongest year, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Yeah, so. And there's more happening, obviously, with Alaska and Hawaiian. That an interesting one from a face value, quite disparate networks, and really interested to see how the regulators handle that. So really want to watch in 24. But again, I think, as you say, a reflection of that acceptance we're powering out of COVID, and we're thinking again about the longer term in plenty of areas around the world.
So we have taken an unusually positive outlook, probably not that positive, but we
tried.
Take a positive and look at the upsides and the positives for the year for the airline industry. We'll be back on more regular form looking at the challenges and risks that this industry might face in the second half.
Hello listeners, I'm Andy Mason and I want to introduce you to Beyond Entertainment, a new podcast from Panasonic Avionics. Each week we sit down with the best and brightest in our industry for a quick chat on the future of passenger experience. Everything from display and audio technology to in-flight Wi-Fi and killer digital content to meaningful market research. We're looking at what's now, what's new and what's next. So join us as we explore the passenger experience. Go Beyond Entertainment. Available now on your favourite podcasting platforms or on our website, panasonic.aero/Beyond Entertainment.
So welcome back, and we talked before the break about the positives, of which, it was broadly, I think, a positive year for the industry, and certainly some of the things that we worried might be a problem weren't as much of a problem, but some things were. Revenues went up, but it is just as well they went up because costs were on the up as well, weren't they?
Yeah, and I think this is all, as you say, we tried our hardest just to focus on the positives, but yeah, this is all linked really, because as you say, we've seen while traffic was lagging 2019 levels, revenues were way above certainly on a looking at a macro level of the industry. So a key point is that the second there starts to be any softness in those yields, and as we talked about, it's always historically been a low margin industry, and it's certainly that doesn't seem to have changed coming out of COVID. So I think something really we're going to be watching closely is our costs looking into 2024. When you look at some of the US carriers towards the end of the year and some of their financial reporting, I think because some certainly on the low cost side have started to see some sort of softness in fares and some sort of demand moderation compared with the real strong period they'd had for the previous 12 months. They're starting to notice, I think, that those higher costs are biting a bit. So, a few surprising losses at a couple of carriers in what was generally quite a positive period. And I think it's obviously the US is one to watch because it relatively advanced in terms of the big markets coming out of COVID. I think because of its large domestic market and other connectivity with places that lowered the COVID restrictions more quickly. I think that could be a bellwether for what might happen elsewhere. I think those costs, when we're talking about costs, I think one is particularly important and possibly structural is on the labour side. So we know that in the US market there's challenges around getting pilots. So some of the new labour agreements have included some quite eye-watering, increases in salaries for pilots and in crew more generally. And at the moment, as you say, has mostly been offset by the the strong revenues. But it is a structural change, and when capacity starts coming back even more, when there's new aircraft coming into the market, and it will be interesting to watch and something to keep a close eye on. And fuel as well is interesting, isn't it? Because that probably gets more headlines as a cost, quite rightly, because it's in some cases because of the percentage of costs it is for airlines. But that's sort of, again, some doom-laden predictions for that a few weeks and months ago, but perhaps not quite as bad as it looked.
I mean, fuel it's always the thing that people worry about, and you've obviously had, a major spike across the year. It has sort of dropped off a little bit. In fact, largely the forecasts now are that it won't be quite such a problem. It's still at a high level. It's, nobody expects it to drop massively down, and airlines are particularly hard hit by what's called the crack spread, the extra cost involved in refining it for jet fuel. So it is still a major factor, but I think quite often when you talk about airlines and you talk about their environment, it is actually the thing they struggle with the most isn't necessarily high costs per se, although I'm sure they would complain about that. But it is the volatility, it is the change in costs. So I think to some extent airlines had high fuel costs baked into at least their near to midterm environment. It is when you have additional costs, whether that's labour, and that's obviously when there's change in airport fees and stuff. But it's those kinds of costs that probably worry airlines a bit more. Though undoubtedly the fundamentals of the oil price isn't great, I think you're broadly seeing airlines sort of comfortable with where they are. There doesn't seem to be a feeling that it's going to get any worse.
No, exactly, and that volatility is clearly important. I think, and on that sort of theme, I think that when you look at, I guess, some of the other challenges looking into 24, whether it's supply chain, MRO delays, parts shortages, and the obvious skill shortages. So there are, in so many economies, there's a lack of skilled workers, and for a multitude of reasons, but often because people were laid off during COVID and found other jobs or retired. But equally, I think the industry's had a while to get used to that, and we've heard a lot more CEOs, I guess, this year talk about those limits on growth and those sort of realities for the foreseeable future. And I suppose while they continue to be a real pain for a multitude of reasons looking into 24, I guess there also isn't any excuse really to be surprised by them. So that they are, again, key challenges in 24, but equally I think in a lot of cases, that there has been time to prepare for this, and unfortunately, an aircraft being 6 months late is sort of baked in, as is the fact that your A320 is going to sit on the ground for 4 weeks longer than you would normally have expected it to because of the lack of spare engines or whatever at the moment. It's the reality that the industry is facing. And like you say, it's when there's a new thing chucked into the mix, that's when it really gets difficult. And I don't think we can, looking ahead to 24, really make any guesses in that regard. I mean, as we've seen, with the situation in Israel and Gaza, these things come along, not out of nowhere, but certainly without too much warning sometimes. And as we saw in 22 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, these things will happen, and I guess the impact of those will play through.
And you talk about the geopolitical things and the situation in Israel and the impact there is a very good example. We certainly journalistically, we're there immediately thinking, well, what's the impact? How is this impacting? You can see there are clearly some airlines, as was the case with Russia and Ukraine. There are some airlines which are very directly impacted and has a huge impact on their fortunes. but you're looking at what the wider impact is, and of course there's a certainly with Russia-Ukraine there was a much wider impact around fuel, and of course the overflights element for Russia was a major issue. But I think what we've seen with the whole situation in Israel and Gaza, it's very much, it has a short-term impact because airlines suddenly will have a portion of their routes they can't operate, and they have some capacity that isn't doing anything. And those near-term targets, especially we've seen in the fourth quarter, targets around traffic revenue growth and by definition an impact on profit. There is a hit there, but of course once they've had a couple of months, they can deploy that capacity elsewhere. They can work out where to fly it. And at the moment, because capacity is constrained, because you have markets coming back, there are other places you can deploy that capacity and deploy it relatively comfortably. So for many airlines, they might want to, in an ideal world, be serving Tel Aviv because it's a good profitable market. But actually, it doesn't have a massive long-term effect on large amounts of the carriers. And you look at, IATA, Willie Walsh was flagging, even October traffic, a month of the heaviest disruption, airlines had the least time to adjust their capacity. But, Middle East traffic as a whole was on the up. That grew again. So, at an aggregate level, it doesn't necessarily have that much impact. And you have seen, we've seen Lufthansa Group talking about resuming some portion of flights to Tel Aviv in January. Already there's sort of hints that hopefully that might not be a long-term impact. The impact around Russia-Ukraine, again, you've had airlines who are very affected. Someone like Finnair, for example, were very affected by that because that impacted the whole Asian strategy. But again, they've had some time to sort of come up with an alternative.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think the key point you make there is that capacity constraint globally, again, does mean that, it's not that difficult to, while clearly deeply regret what's going on in some of these countries, it's not that difficult to find somewhere else to fly your aircraft. And as we know, that isn't going to change in 24. I think the problem everywhere is the lack of aircraft. So when these challenges come up, and that, that's not to say they all play out like that, but certainly some of these challenges, while they have a very severe impact on a small number of carriers, don't even, sort of touch the sides in some cases when you stand back and look at the bigger industry. Perhaps if they were happening in a period where everyone was over capacity and would be felt more keenly elsewhere. But certainly, in 24, I think we can safely say there aren't going to be many carriers who would struggle to find somewhere else to put their capacity. Clearly, looking beyond geopolitical issues, and we can't guess what's to come next there. We do know that natural disasters are a theme, and talking about sustainability in the airline industry, we often focus on sustainable fuel and that side of things, what it means for the business of running an airline. But certainly we also know that one thing they've got to get used to is probably more instances of we saw the devastating wildfires in Hawaii, for example, some similarly in Rhodes, I think, last year, and the impact that had on airlines. And we've recently seen him, and while I don't think so far it's had a huge impact in terms of airspace, I think the volcano in Iceland is a reminder, a very stark reminder, I think, there of while we talk about things in the industry being out of the hand of the airlines, I think that's probably the ultimate example, really. And while obviously, as I say, the volcano hasn't necessarily affected airspace, I think some of the airlines in Iceland will certainly be seeing a bit of a demand drop off for travel into the country as a result. So I think in 24, again, obviously, as I say, we can't guess what's coming, but any airline that's, walking blindly into next year, not worrying about those sorts of things, or not with plans in place to do all those kind of things, is clearly a failing, I think, because we know these things are going to come. And as I say, it's an aspect of the sustainability challenge that perhaps doesn't get talked about quite as much, but certainly airlines as businesses having those contingency plans in place are increasingly important when we know these natural events are going to become more frequent, I think, unfortunately, looking into the future there.
Also around environment, I think one of the big stories of this year, which ties into a number of those things, is around the potential for government policy in order to tackle the environment having an impact. And we've seen that very obviously in play at Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, where, the government unilaterally attempted to enforce some capacity cuts there as a way of countering aircraft noise, or, which is kind of almost a forgotten about environmental topic in amongst everything else. And, that was very interesting in terms of the airlines kind of won a reprieve on that. But, I mean, the reprieve they've won, and that in itself was interesting because you had not only the European Commission, you had the US Department of Transport kind of weighing in, in support of the airlines. In this instance, sort of based around the manner in which the project was done. So it doesn't necessarily rule out that capacity cuts could still come at the airport, and Schiphol wasn't the only airport where this kind of thing is happening. And, capacity at airports in Europe, one way or the other, is going to be a challenge, because it is difficult to see that it is going to be any easier to get capacity. And the idea that you might lose some capacity, remains a concern for airlines.
It does, yeah. And like you say, it's sort of not sure whether that Schiphol story in particular should have been in the good news bit, because it felt like that temporary reprieve at least was very welcome, because as is pointed out quite often, Schiphol is an incredibly busy hub airport in a place that, it's an outsized airport for what the local O&D traffic would be. So it's very much, a model hub airport there, and such a huge thing to start, capping that capacity and, sort of, upsetting the business model. So, but to get that reprieve was sort of one of this year's good news stories. I don't think anyone's going to be relaxing thinking, well, that's out of the way now. Clearly, it's encouraging that there was a degree of intervention at a governmental or above level to try and stop it happening. But then equally, like you say, I think recently as politicians talking about capping night flights at Brussels, or situation in Mexico, I think, where there's some moves by the government to cap operations at the main airport there. I think, it's something I know that IATA are concerned about, and I don't think anyone would be relaxed on that looking into next year. And as you say, I think one of the key points here is that there's sort of a danger that the very much the shift in the narrative is towards, certainly in some geographies, that the idea would even be considering talking about expanding airport capacity in certain geographies is for the birds a bit, when you're kind of fighting just to stop the existing capacity being cut. So, that said, there are, areas of the world, we look to Dubai, for example, where they're talking about moving to the new airport there. I think that there clearly are areas where that challenge doesn't exist, but I think it will probably only like to spread as the airline sustainability challenge grows. So I think how that plays out next year will be really interesting. And if we see more examples of it coming up, it's clearly something that is a concern for the industry. And it will again challenge those, as we've seen at Schiphol. It won't just be local carriers that will be worried about it. It'll be those that fly into those airports as well. And that throws up all sorts of challenges around what open skies agreements there are between the countries and things. So, yeah.
The last area just to talk about, I think, and we decided to put this in the challenges section rather than the positive, but it is a story which, arguably you could put in either, especially after Virgin Atlantic's 100% SAF operated flight, is around that environmental challenge and so forth. There has been progress. Across the year, but I suppose you could argue that the industry's progress towards SAF, when we say the industry, I think we're talking about, a far wider industry that goes well beyond what the airlines have and what the airlines are able to control themselves. It does feel like, despite all the progress that has been made, and this undoubted progress, that the challenge has just got a little bit bigger.
I think so, yeah. I think And that's partly, and airlines have not been backward about sort of saying that, I think, in some cases as well. It's been through so many stages, I think, in a few short years, that the airline's sort of sustainability journey. And I think it's sort of recently got to the point now where, there are some mandates in place around SAF usage, and certainly in Europe, there are airlines who want to be using more of it, whether there's a mandate in place or not. But I think there's a very stark realization that, while it was great progress to agree these net zero targets and everything, the work really needs to happen. As you say, that's not in any way all within the grasp of the airline industry to do on its own. So, and on SAF it's clearly, when you look at the amount being produced and what needs to happen just to start touching the sides of those targets, whether it's 5%, 10% usage by 2030, whatever, it's pretty big. And as everyone will point out, it takes several years to get a SAF plant up and running. So if we end 2024 and there's not much more production or much more production in the works than 23 began, it does start to look pretty challenging. And of course, the SAF that is produced is incredibly expensive, several times the cost of jet fuel. So that challenge is ramping up, and the airline industry isn't backwards about highlighting that. There are obviously other parts of that whole sustainability challenge to keep an eye on. I think contrails is an interesting one, whether if more research starts coming through that they have a much bigger impact on the environment than is currently presumed. I think that will be an interesting one to watch. Again, I think some of the SAF perhaps plays a role in countering that. Certainly, eventually hydrogen power could be a big part in that. But it'd be interesting to see how 24 develops in that regard, I think.
Well, we're going to be thinking a bit more about how 2024 develops with a special bonus pod that we have lined up for early in the new year. So we will be looking at our airline stories to watch. I think that's how we're framing it, isn't it?
Yeah, we've had a go at the positive and negative, and I think we'll try and couch it slightly differently for that one.
We'll see how that goes. So we'll be coming back at you with another pod early in January. But for now and for this year, Lewis, that's it. Thank you very much, as ever.
Cheers, Graham. Have a good Christmas.
Yes, you too, and to everyone listening to this, or hope you had a good Christmas if you're listening to this. If you'd already broken away and are listening to this after Christmas. So thanks again to Panasonic Avionics for sponsoring the podcast. Do give the Beyond Entertainment podcast a listen. A reminder, you can catch up with all the news and stories we've mentioned on this podcast at flyglobal.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please like us, please review us, and don't forget to subscribe so you get new episodes in your feeds immediately without having to do anything. And we'll see you again next year.